Nathan Pierce slammed the door of his sleek black SUV, exhaling sharply as he took in his surroundings. Towering pine trees, an overgrown dirt path, and the absolute absence of cell reception, it was exactly what he'd signed up for, yet somehow he already regretted it. A week off the grid, no emails. No business calls, no multi-million-dollar deals hanging over his head. His best friend Jake had practically forced him into this. "You're burning out, man," Jake had said. "Get away from the city. Clear your head." Now, standing in the middle of nowhere with nothing but a duffel bag and a map to a remote cabin, Nathan wondered if this was the worst decision he'd ever made. The map led him deeper into the forest, where the air smelled of pine and damp earth. After nearly an hour of walking, frustration gnawed at him. The path was barely marked, and every step felt like an eternity. Then, just as he was about to turn back, he saw a small, rustic cabin nestled between the trees, smoke curling from its chimney. Relief flooded him until the front door swung open and a woman stepped onto the porch, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. She was stunning. Messy dark curls framed her sharp cheekbones, and her green eyes, wild and piercing, locked onto him with suspicion. She wore a flannel shirt, ripped jeans, and boots caked in mud. This was not the welcoming party he expected. "You're trespassing," she stated flatly. Nathan blinked. "I what?" "This is my land," she said, hands on her hips. "Unless you have a good reason for standing in my front yard, you should probably turn around." Nathan pulled out the crumpled paper from his pocket. "I rented a cabin out here for the week. Supposed to be off the grid, no service, no distractions, just me and nature." He glanced around. "This is the right place, isn't it?" She snatched the paper from his hands, scanning it before sighing. "Unbelievable, that idiot gave you the wrong directions." "Your cabin's on the other side of the creek." Nathan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Fantastic, and how exactly do I get there?" She crossed her arms again, assessing him. "You don't. The creek's flooded from last night's storm. You'll have to wait until the water levels drop." "Wait, as in stay here?" She eyed him like he was an inconvenience. "Unless you want to hike back in the dark and risk getting lost." Nathan glanced at the sky. The sun had already started dipping behind the trees. As much as he hated the idea of imposing, he wasn't stupid. "Fine," he muttered, "just for the night." She sighed before stepping aside. "Come in before the mosquitoes eat you alive." Nathan stepped inside, immediately hit with the scent of burning wood and something faintly sweet, honey maybe. The cabin was small but cozy. A worn couch sat near the fireplace, shelves lined with books, and a small kitchen tucked into the corner. It was nothing like the modern glass-walled penthouse he was used to, but it had charm. "You can sleep on the couch," she said, grabbing a blanket from a nearby chair and tossing it onto the cushions. Nathan raised an eyebrow. "Generous." She shot him a look. "Don't push your luck," he smirked, "and here I was hoping for a warm welcome." She rolled her eyes, but he didn't miss the flicker of amusement behind them. As she moved toward the kitchen, Nathan leaned against the wooden beam. "So do I get to know the name of the woman who's reluctantly letting me crash here?" She hesitated before finally saying, "Claire." "Claire." He tested the name on his tongue. "Nice to meet you, Claire. I'm Nathan." "Figured." He raised an eyebrow. "Oh," she shrugged, "you look like a Nathan." "And you definitely look like a guy who doesn't belong out here." Nathan chuckled, shaking his head. "You're not wrong." Claire grabbed a pot from the stove, stirring its contents. "I was about to make dinner. If you want to eat, you can help." Nathan hesitated. Cooking wasn't exactly his forte. He was used to five-star restaurants, private chefs, and meals that cost more than most people's rent. But something about Claire's no-nonsense attitude made him want to prove he wasn't entirely useless. "Fine," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "But if I burn the place down, it's on you," Claire smirked. "Noted." For the first time in years, Nathan felt something unexpected, a sense of ease. Maybe this forced break wouldn't be so bad after all. Nathan woke to the soft crackling of the fire and the scent of something rich and earthy drifting through the cabin. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and found Claire at the small wooden table near the window, a steaming mug in her hands. Morning light filtered through the trees outside, casting golden streaks across the floor. She didn't acknowledge him right away, instead gazing out at the forest beyond. There was a quiet stillness about her, a kind of peace he rarely saw in people. It was the opposite of everything he knew: no meetings, no calls, no constant pressure to make the next deal. Nathan swung his legs off the couch, stretching the stiffness from his muscles. "You always wake up this early." Claire took a sip from her mug before finally looking over at him. "When you live out here, the sun decides when you wake up." He ran a hand through his hair. "I think I'd rather let an alarm clock do the deciding." Her lips twitched slightly, but she didn't respond. Instead, she pushed a second mug across the table toward him. Nathan hesitated before accepting it. The coffee was strong, slightly bitter, but it warmed him instantly. He wasn't used to anything but the perfectly brewed blends from the city's finest cafes, but something about this felt more satisfying. Claire leaned back in her chair, watching him. "So, what's a guy like you doing out here? You don't exactly scream wilderness survivalist." Nathan exhaled, setting his mug down. "Taking a break." She raised an eyebrow. "From what?" He debated how much to say, but something about Claire made him feel less inclined to put on the usual polished, businesslike front. "My life, work, everything," he gestured vaguely. "My best friend said I needed to unplug for a while, thought I'd give it a shot." Claire studied him for a beat before nodding as if she understood more than she let on. "And how's the Great Escape treating you so far?" Nathan huffed a quiet laugh. "Well, considering I got lost and ended up in a stranger's cabin, I'd say it's off to a rocky start," Claire smirked. "Could be worse." He gave her a skeptical look. "Oh yeah, how?" She shrugged, her expression unreadable. "You could have run into a bear instead of me." Nathan chuckled, shaking his head. "Fair point." A comfortable silence settled between them. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and the distant sound of running water hinted that the creek was still high. Claire stood, grabbing a worn flannel jacket from the back of her chair. "I need to check the creek. If the water's gone down, you might be able to get to your cabin today." Nathan didn't miss the underlying message. She wasn't the type to enjoy company she hadn't planned for. Still, he found himself reluctant to leave just yet. "I'll come with you," he offered. Claire eyed him, as if considering whether he'd slow her down. Then, with a slight nod, she headed for the door. They walked in silence for a while, the forest alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. Nathan wasn't used to this kind of quiet, not the artificial stillness of soundproof offices or penthouse suites, but real, breathing quiet. Claire moved easily through the terrain, her steps sure and practiced. Nathan, on the other hand, stumbled once or twice over roots and uneven ground, earning a smirk from her that she didn't bother to hide. When they reached the creek, Claire frowned. The water was still high, rushing over the rocks in a way that made crossing impossible. "Looks like you're stuck here a little longer," she said. Nathan couldn't tell if she was annoyed or simply stating a fact. Either way, he found himself oddly pleased. Claire turned back toward the cabin, and Nathan followed. By the time they returned, the sun was higher, warming the air. Claire grabbed a hatchet from the porch and tossed a small glance his way. "Ever chopped wood before?" Nathan scoffed. "Do I look like I've chopped wood before?" Claire smirked, tossing him a smaller axe. "No. But you're about to." What followed was an hour of Nathan realizing just how little his gym workouts had prepared him for manual labor. Claire, meanwhile, made it look effortless, splitting logs with practiced ease. By the time they finished, Nathan was sweating, his muscles aching in ways they never had before. "You survived," Claire said, leaning against the porch railing with her arms crossed. Nathan wiped his brow, out of breath. "Barely," she chuckled, shaking her head. As the day stretched on, Nathan found himself adapting to the slower pace. Claire wasn't one for small talk, but she answered his questions when he asked, and every now and then she'd toss a question his way too. By evening they sat on the porch, the sky streaked in hues of pink and orange. Nathan glanced at Claire, who was quietly whittling a piece of wood with a small knife. "You ever think about leaving this place?" She didn't look up. "I left once, didn't fit." There was something in her tone that told him not to push. Instead, he leaned back, staring at the sky. "I think I might be starting to understand why you stayed." Claire didn't respond, but he caught the faintest hint of a smile before she turned away. The rain started as a soft drizzle, barely noticeable as it weaved through the dense canopy above. Nathan stood at the edge of the cabin's porch, watching the sky darken by the minute. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, rich and grounding in a way that made the city feel like another world entirely. Claire moved past him, her boots thudding against the wooden planks as she secured a tarp over a stack of firewood. She worked quickly, efficiently, without hesitation. Nathan had spent enough time around people who hesitated, who second-guessed every move in favor of appearances. Claire wasn't like that. The storm rolled in faster than either of them expected. Within minutes, the wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the drizzle turned into a torrential downpour. Water dripped from the porch roof, forming small pools in the dirt below. Nathan turned to find Claire watching the sky, her expression unreadable. He had the distinct feeling she could read the weather better than any forecast. "Bad one?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately, her gaze fixed on the shifting clouds. Then, with a small tilt of her head, she said, "Could be." Something about the way she said it sent a shiver down his spine, and it had nothing to do with the cold. Lightning split the sky in the distance, followed by a deep rumbling of thunder. Nathan had never been one to fear storms. He spent most of his time in glass towers high above the chaos, but out here, it felt different, more immediate, more real. Claire disappeared inside and Nathan followed. She moved through the space with purpose, checking the lantern on the shelf, securing the latches on the windows. He realized she was preparing, the way someone who had lived through enough storms knew to do. The power flickered once, then cut out completely. The cabin was plunged into darkness, save for the glow of the fire still burning in the hearth. Claire didn't react, didn't curse or panic. Instead, she reached for the lantern, lighting it with practiced ease. Nathan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "So much for a peaceful evening." Claire smirked slightly but didn't comment. Instead, she moved toward the small kitchen, grabbing 2 mugs and pouring something warm into them. She handed one to him without a word. He took a sip, the heat spreading through him instantly. The drink was strong, earthy, with a hint of something sweet. He didn't ask what it was. The wind howled against the walls, and for the first time since arriving, Nathan understood just how isolated they were. No phone, no internet, no way to check if the storm would last an hour or all night. Claire sat on the floor near the fire, legs crossed beneath her. She seemed entirely at ease, as if the storm was nothing more than background noise. Nathan lowered himself onto the couch, watching her. "You don't seem worried," he said. She shrugged. "No point in worrying about things you can't control." He considered that. It was a stark contrast to his life, where control was everything. Every business move, every decision, it was all about maintaining power, never letting anything slip through his fingers. Claire, on the other hand, seemed to embrace the unknown. Nathan leaned back, stretching his legs out in front of him. "What made you come back here?" She glanced at him, her expression guarded. For a long moment he thought she wouldn't answer. But then, quietly, she said, "The city wasn't for me." There was more to it, he could tell. Something unspoken lingered in her words, but he didn't push. Instead, he said, "I think I'm starting to understand why." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Oh," he gestured vaguely to the cabin, the storm outside. "Out here, everything is simple. No politics, no endless meetings, no pretending to be someone you're not." She studied him, as if trying to determine whether he actually meant it. "You don't seem like the type who enjoys simple," she said. Nathan chuckled. "I didn't think I was either." Thunder rumbled again, shaking the walls slightly. The fire crackled, filling the silence between them. Claire looked down at the wooden floor, tracing a finger along the grain. "Most people don't stay long out here. They say they want peace, but after a few days, they go back." Nathan knew she was testing him in a way, trying to see if he was just another temporary presence in a place that didn't need him. He didn't have an answer for her. Instead, he simply said, "I'm not most people." Claire's lips quirked slightly, but she didn't argue. The storm raged on outside, but inside, the quiet between them felt heavier than words. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world outside damp and glistening under the soft light filtering through the trees. Nathan stood by the porch, tracing the edge of his mug with his thumb, his gaze fixed on the creek in the distance. The water had calmed. He could leave now. But the thought of walking away from Claire and the life she had built here twisted something deep in his chest. She moved beside him, arms crossed as she studied the landscape with the same quiet intensity she always carried. There was no urgency in her stance, no expectation. And yet, Nathan felt the weight of something unspoken between them, something fragile but undeniable. The past few days had shifted something in him. The constant noise of his usual life, the negotiations, the high-stakes deals, the relentless pace felt distant, almost irrelevant. Here, in this quiet corner of the world, he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. Claire didn't turn to him as she spoke, her voice steady. "The creek's low enough now." Nathan exhaled slowly, setting his mug down on the railing. "Yeah." Silence stretched between them. He could feel her waiting, bracing herself for what came next. "I should probably get going," he said, though the words felt wrong in his mouth. Claire nodded, but there was no relief in her expression. If anything, there was something guarded there, something wary. He hesitated before pushing off the railing, stepping closer to her. "Come with me." She finally looked at him then, her green eyes sharp, assessing. "Nathan, I mean it." He reached for her hand, wrapping his fingers around hers, grounding himself in the warmth of her skin. "Come back with me, just for a little while. See what it's like." Claire's lips parted slightly, but she didn't pull away. "You're asking me to leave everything I know," she said, her voice softer now. "I'm asking you to take a chance," he corrected. "The same way I did when I came out here." Her fingers curled slightly against his palm, and for a moment he let himself hope. Then she exhaled, stepping back. "That's not who I am, Nathan." Frustration flickered through him, not at her, but at the situation. "So that's it. We just pretend none of this happened." Claire's jaw tightened. "I'm not pretending anything." Nathan ran a hand through his hair, his pulse hammering in his chest. "Then what do you want me to do, Claire? Walk away and forget about you?" Her breath caught, and for the first time she looked uncertain, vulnerable. "You don't belong here," she whispered. "And you don't belong in my world," he challenged. She hesitated. That was all he needed to see. Nathan took a step closer, his voice softer now. "I don't care where we are, Claire. I just care about you." Her lips parted, and for a moment he thought she might say something, might reach for him the same way he was reaching for her. Then she shook her head, forcing a small, sad smile. "You'll go back and this place will become a memory. That's how it always happens." Nathan's chest tightened. "Not this time." Claire swallowed hard, then turned away, disappearing into the cabin before he could say anything else. The walk to his cabin was the longest of his life. Nathan barely noticed the path, barely registered the sound of the creek beside him. The moment he stepped inside, everything felt wrong, too empty, too quiet. His phone sat on the table where he'd left it, blinking with missed calls and texts, reminders of the life waiting for him. For the first time in his career, he didn't care. Nathan left the cabin 2 days later. His driver was waiting at the edge of the forest, the sleek black car looking out of place against the dirt road. As he slid into the back seat, his assistant rattled off his scheduled meetings, calls, urgent matters that required his attention. Nathan barely heard a word. He had spent his life making decisions with ruthless efficiency, never questioning, never hesitating. Now, for the first time, he had made the wrong choice. And he wasn't about to let it stay that way. 2 weeks passed. Nathan had returned to his world, the endless meetings, the high-rise offices, the polished perfection of everything he had built. And yet, nothing felt right. He saw Claire everywhere, in the way the wind moved through the city streets, in the scent of pine that clung to his jacket. In the quiet moments between calls, when he found himself staring at nothing, aching for something he couldn't name. Enough. Nathan pushed away from his desk, grabbing his keys without a second thought. His driver barely had time to ask where they were going before Nathan gave him the only answer that mattered. Back to the cabin. The drive felt longer this time, impatience thrumming through his veins. When he finally reached the dirt road, he didn't hesitate. He left the car behind, moving through the trees with a singular focus. The cabin came into view the same as before. But this time, when he knocked, Claire didn't meet him with suspicion. She met him with wide eyes and a sharp inhale, as if she had been waiting, as if she had known. Nathan didn't waste a second. "I love you," Claire's breath hitched. "I should have said it before I left," he continued, stepping closer. "I should have fought harder, should have made you see that this isn't temporary for me." She swallowed, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. Nathan reached for her, his fingers brushing against hers. "I don't care where we are, Claire, I just want to be with you." For a long moment, she didn't move. Then slowly, she exhaled, tilting her head up to meet his gaze. "You're really bad at letting things go, aren't you?" Nathan cracked a small, breathless laugh. "Terrible at it." Claire hesitated, then, finally, she let her fingers curl around his. And just like that, the world settled back into place. Nathan didn't know how long they stood there, fingers intertwined, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air between them. The forest hummed around them, the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of unseen creatures filling the silence. Claire's hand was warm in his, her grip hesitant but real. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed her. Claire glanced away, her jaw tight, as if she was still trying to process the fact that he was standing in front of her again. Nathan had expected resistance. He had expected her to argue, to remind him that their worlds didn't fit together. But she didn't. Instead, she exhaled, stepping back just enough to break the contact between them. "You came back." Nathan nodded, his pulse hammering. "Yeah." She studied him, her green eyes searching his face for something: hesitation, regret, uncertainty. She wouldn't find any. "You didn't have to," she murmured. "I did," he said firmly. "I had to." Claire's fingers curled at her sides, and for a split second he thought she might bolt, but she didn't. She held her ground, her expression unreadable. Nathan took a slow breath, steadying himself before saying, "I don't do things halfway, Claire. And I don't run from something just because it's difficult. I walked away once and I hated every second of it. So unless you tell me right now that there's no part of you that wants us, I'm not leaving." Claire's throat bobbed as she swallowed. Nathan waited. The seconds stretched, heavy with everything unsaid. Then finally, she whispered, "I thought about you every day." Something in Nathan's chest unclenched, relief flooding through him like wildfire. He stepped closer, closing the space between them once more, his voice quieter now. "Then stop pushing me away." Claire's lips parted, but before she could say anything, the wind picked up, rustling the trees around them. She shivered slightly, the cool air cutting through her thin sweater. Nathan didn't hesitate. He shrugged off his jacket, draping it over her shoulders. Claire stiffened but didn't protest. She looked up at him, something raw flickering in her gaze. "You don't belong here, Nathan." "I belong wherever you are," her breath hitched. He reached for her hand again, his grip firm but gentle. "Come with me, Claire," she hesitated, "and if I can't, then I'll stay." Claire's eyes widened slightly. "You can't stay." "Why not?" He wasn't bluffing. He'd built an empire from nothing. He could build a life here, too, if it meant being with her. Claire shook her head, exasperated. "Because this isn't your world. You'd hate it eventually." Nathan's lips twitched. "You're underestimating me," she exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You don't get it, Nathan. I need this life. I need the quiet, the simplicity, the space to just be. You thrive in chaos. You love it." Nathan didn't deny it. He had loved it once. But now the thought of returning to a life without her felt unbearable. "I love you more," he said simply. Claire's breath caught. Nathan reached up, gently tucking a loose curl behind her ear. "I don't know how this works, Claire. I don't know if we build a life here, or if you come with me, or if we figure out something in between. But I do know that I'm not walking away from you again. So tell me what you need, and we'll figure it out together." Claire studied him, her expression torn between fear and hope. Then, quietly, she whispered, "I don't want to do this alone anymore." Nathan exhaled, pulling her into his arms without hesitation. Claire melted against him, her fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt as if anchoring herself to him. They stood like that for a long time, the world around them fading into the background. When Claire finally pulled back, her eyes were shining. "We'll figure it out." Nathan cupped her face, brushing his thumb over her cheek. "Together." And for the first time in his life, he really knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Nathan didn't know exactly when the rain started again, but by the time they reached the cabin's porch, small droplets clung to Claire's hair, making dark strands curl tightly against her skin. He couldn't stop looking at her, at the way her breath came a little faster, as if she was still catching up to what she had just agreed to. They were going to figure it out, together. Inside, the fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows against the wooden walls. Nathan moved instinctively, adding another log, stoking the embers back to life. He wasn't used to this, fixing things with his own hands, adjusting to a world where money couldn't solve everything, but it felt right. Natural. Claire stood by the table, arms crossed, watching him. Something about her expression had softened, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked uncertain. He straightened, dusting his palms off on his jeans. "Say what you're thinking," she hesitated. "What if we don't fit?" Nathan met her gaze steady. "Then we make it fit." Claire let out a breath, shaking her head with a small, disbelieving smile. "You make everything sound so simple." "It is." He stepped closer, placing his hands on her waist, grounding her. "You and me, that's the only thing that matters. We'll figure out the details as we go." She searched his face, something still guarded in her expression, but she didn't pull away. He could feel the tension in her body, the way she was still fighting against the instinct to push him back. Nathan wasn't going to let her. "Tell me what you need," he said. "What would make this work for you?" Claire bit her lip, considering. "I don't want to leave this place." "Then I won't ask you to," her brow furrowed. "But your life, my life is wherever you are," he interrupted, voice firm. "I don't have to be in a high-rise to run my business. I have people for that. I can be here as much as you need me to be." Claire exhaled, shaking her head. "You'd really do that?" For you, he brushed his thumb over her hip. In a heartbeat. She swallowed hard and then, finally, she let herself lean into him, her forehead pressed against his chest, and Nathan wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. For the first time since he'd left the city, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The next few days passed in a blur of quiet adjustments. Nathan stayed, making himself useful where he could. He helped Claire reinforce the fence around the cabin, repaired the loose hinges on the front door, even attempted to cook breakfast one morning, though Claire had promptly taken over when it became clear he had no idea what he was doing. They fell into an easy rhythm, one that felt strangely natural despite how different their lives had been up until now. Nathan found himself waking up earlier, adapting to the slower pace of things. He liked the quiet mornings with Claire, the way she moved through her routine with a certainty that made him want to learn everything about her world. But he also knew this wasn't sustainable, not forever. Claire could live here, he couldn't, not entirely. They needed a plan. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the last light fade behind the trees, Nathan finally brought it up. "We can split our time," he said. Claire glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we don't have to choose one or the other." He turned to face her fully. "I can set up shop here part of the time. And when I need to be in the city, you come with me." Claire hesitated. "Nathan, just for a few weeks at a time," he pressed. "You don't have to stay forever, just enough to see what it's like. To see if you could be happy there too." She looked down at her hands, fingers tracing the grain of the wood beneath them. "I don't know if I'll ever fit in your world." Nathan reached over, taking her hand in his. "You don't have to fit into my world, Claire. We'll build our own." She exhaled slowly, then nodded. "Okay." Relief surged through him, and before he could stop himself, he leaned in, capturing her lips in a slow, lingering kiss. Claire melted into him, her fingers tightening against his. And just like that, everything else faded away. A month later, Claire stepped onto the balcony of Nathan's penthouse, her breath catching at the sight of the city stretching out below them. The skyline glittered, skyscrapers glowing against the night sky, and for the first time, she didn't feel like an outsider looking in. Nathan wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What do you think?" Claire let out a small laugh. "It's different," he smirked. "I'll take that as a win." She turned in his arms, tilting her head. "You really think we can make this work?" Nathan brushed a strand of hair from her face, his gaze warm and unwavering. "I know we can." Claire exhaled, then smiled. "Then let's do it." And as Nathan kissed her again, the city lights flickering around them, he knew without a doubt this was the best decision he'd ever made. Their worlds had collided in the most unexpected way, and he wouldn't change a single thing.